Spiritual Unfoldment. Part 6. Spiritual Unfoldment. The gradual development or revelation of the spiritual. Spiritual retardment. Lack of spiritual unfoldment. In giving the interpretations of that as we find, much more of this should be given to those who are responsible for the entity's advent into the material world, and as to what then may be expected of the entity, and warnings as to how those who are responsible shall environ the entity for greater unfoldment. As this entity was in the Mercurian realm, we find the mental consciousness, or the high mental abilities, which is combined with Mars gives great activity. Also combined with Mercury and Jupiter, it gives the entity the special confidence in self as a manager, as a director, or as one entrusted with confidence and relationships dealing with great organizations, corporations, states or nations. Thus, we will find that the entity may apply itself in any of these directions, making self a channel for material, mental and spiritual unfoldment. If there is kept a balance between the preparations of self in this or that activity, the preservation of the present, the advancement of the mental and the material forces, these of themselves become improved. How? As has been shown from the mental self. A greater unfoldment as to what is to be done today, if done, then leaves those activities for the morrow. Hence as he gives, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Did he say sufficient is the good thereof? Rather this is the growth. Hence there would be the activities of self in all of these directions. The proper preparation by keeping first. What? The spiritual connection with the sources of supply, which is the spiritual inner self, through those promises of creative forces, those energies and activities that arise from the promptings, not of exaltation or glorification of self, but of thy Creator. Which is a part of thyself but not thyself, lest thou keep in accord with him. Hence as these develop there may come all those understandings, unfoldments necessary in thy daily activity. 4. No. And as may be given greater expression as there is the unfoldment in the minds of others. In a period in the earth of any individual soul entity, there are activities that leave their stamp, their impression, their body, not of a physical nature, not even of a mental nature, save as of the soul. And thus that attained is never lost. That is lost is never regained, but that which is the builder is of the spirit and the soul. Thus an interpretation of those experiences of an entity in the earth gives the basic mind and soul of an individual. Hence choose that experience that has, to self, a meaning, yet may not be wholly understood. For it is ever here a little and there a little, line upon line, precept upon precept, that builds the soul of an entity towards its desire of expression in the infinite. God. How can she best develop her psychic ability? As we would find, through that which may aid in the unfoldment of self as in relation to the creative influences that arise within self, an idea of which may be had through the perusal and application of that which has been given. Contemplated and given through these sources. On meditation. And seeking as individuals in a cooperative manner to show themselves approved unto God, workmen that need not be ashamed, rightly divining the words of truth, should be the purpose, the aim, the desire of each and every individual that associates or affiliates itself with such a group. In presenting in their experience that which may be gained from the study of that prepared as the thought to lead or guide, as the purpose, that each soul would find development for itself to become a better channel, a better servant of the Lord that each seeks to manifest in its individual life. And as a group, present same in such a cooperative way and manner as to make for an influence that may induce or lead others to make their lives as channels for a greater service in His name. Not that any individual would be, should be, compelled or sought. Other than they that are called in His name, that they as individuals, as a group, may show forth the Lord's death till He come again. This should be the purpose, the aim, the desire. As to how each may better accomplish this in the experience, it is the development and the unfoldment of a practical, a manifested, and exemplified life in the service of the Master. And, as he has given, a new commandment give I unto you, that ye love one another, that ye keep that which is committed unto thee against that day, when each must in its own way present, that it is builded in its experience as a service unto him, that gave, if ye love me, keep my commandments, and I will come and abide with thee. I will not leave thee comfortless, but will give that ye ask in my name, believing, for I go to the Father and ye that abide in me abide in the Father also. Before that we find the entity was in the Atlantean land and in those periods before Adam was in the earth. The entity was among those who were then thought projections, and the physical being had the union of sex in the one body, and yet a real musician on pipes or reed instruments. There is nothing impossible for the entity to attain in fame or fortune or in its spiritual unfoldment, and yet these will not be easy until the entity has conquered self. In giving an interpretation of the urges latent and manifested, and as to how the entity may use its abilities to the greater unfoldment, how it may meet those urges latent and manifested which are of the nature of hindrances, we would give those interpretations, not only from the material sojourns in the earth, but from those consciousnesses of this entity in other realms, of other dimensions. Do know thy ideal, spiritually, mentally, and physically. Then applying same, study to show thyself approved, unto God, a workman not ashamed, rightly divining the words of truth and keeping self from condemning others, from being pessimistic even in the face of adversity. These will bring to the entity the awareness of the closer walk with that divine force that is the light of the whole world. In giving the interpretations of the records we would minimize the faults, and we would magnify the virtues, yet as we find, little may be accomplished by the entity, unless there are definite stands taken as to the activity of physical individuals in the material world for activities and unfoldment in another consciousness. The entity would do well if it will make its greater contributions to the world of affairs, to write books, especially those as to discipline in the direction of children, those of the teenage years. This do. We will change the vibrations of the entity so as to become more alert, more keen to the activities which pertain to all forms of information given to others. The study of peoples, the study of the natures of lands, organized efforts with the producers from soil, those who are active in the judgments between activities of the fellow men. All of these were, and indeed are, parts of the entity's experience. Then, cooperation is the basis of that through which the entity would find outlets, better activities in its experience, in applying itself for material, mental or spiritual unfoldment. Know in whom ye believe and know that it arises from the spiritual sources from within. Know that music is that which may span the distance from the finite to the infinite, and in same the entity may find the harmony necessary for the greater unfoldment. They who would gain the greater will suffer the more. Those who would attain to a more perfect understanding of the true relationships of an individual to creative forces and using of same constructively, recognize the unfoldment of the mind through the experiences. We have the outline which, if applied in the experience of the entity, will give an opportunity not only for an expression of self, but would give years yet of peace, of quiet, of unfoldment for this entity. It would be well if the abilities of the entity were applied in writing, dictating the experience of itself through even the periods which have been a part of the present physical consciousness, not the autobiography, but that the law of the Lord is perfect, ye have seen it in its variations in many angles of different tribes and different characters of individuals. And yet ye have experienced this oneness and ideal expressions, and these give then the entity abilities that should find greater expression in, first, short stories. Then, these compiled or spread out. These brought to fruition, the fruit will be good, not only for the entity, but those who seek to know his face. These, though, applied in the character and themes which should be a portion of the entity's expression, may grow to a real fruition, a real expansion of self. Know that ye are in the earth as an opportunity for self, for social unfoldment, and in the relationships with thy companions of both thine own sex and the opposite sex, you should not be merely an idealist, but so live, not necessarily what is called a puritanic life, but so live that all others would wish to be like 52-56. That is an ideal manner of conduct. What is required in this? In self-knowing thine own ideals, spiritually, mentally, materially, not merely as I think this should be it, I think that would be wonderful, that this or that, but write them down on paper and see what they look like. You'll be surprised how oft you can change them from one day to another. Then, knowing the ideal, practice it. Don't have an ideal and then not practice it in thy daily activities. Yes, what a vast difference in environments in the present and that in which the entity began its unfoldment into material, mental and spiritual consciousness in this particular experience. Should the entity write stories, fiction partially, yes, but ever a theme spiritual, as may be illustrated through the lives of individuals the entity would present as characters. As the entity thus applies self in these directions, it may give a greater outlet for the variation in the activities and the environs of the entity, and to exploit in self many of those theories the entity has held, does hold as the way to control people. And yet, as the entity analyzes self, and as it writes about people, know that each soul is a law almost to itself, or is subject to laws in which it is or has not applied the principle of playing the game square. Thus, those tenets or truths which are to be a part of that in the lesson as the entity would present, not merely as a parable, but rather as that lived by those in the various stages of development in body and in unfoldment of mind, to the possibilities of the influences or the influencing of elements in the various phases of human experience. In this field we find the entity may accomplish much. One whose sense of humor has and will oft save many an unpleasant situation. Keep that humor. Rather cultivate same. Entertain it and use it also in thy abilities as a singer, as a teacher, as an announcer where there is the combining of the abilities. This entity should make those preparations and efforts to use its abilities on radio, stage or the like. An appreciation of the dramatic is a part of the experience. This, too, will come in handy and should be cultivated. When the entity undertakes to apply itself in those fields, as we find, it will not be merely materially successful, but can through same contribute to the good of others. Remember, from the spiritual purposes for which a soul enters a material experience, it is not by chance alone. But there have been periods just past, there will be through this year, next year, many souls entering, needing, desiring, building, preparing, even through these periods of stress for peace, just as there will be those with hate, and with those things that must be curbed, if there will come the harmony in the earth. There is needed in entertainment those activities where the abilities of the entity may be used to the encouragement, to the unfoldment of others, humor and in a lovely voice. Those changes which brought those periods of lack of the use of the same have not hindered, provided there is used in same the humor of, the feeling of the spirit with which the entity may use its abilities as a singer, a teacher, and a dramatic director in its relationships to others. In giving the interpretations of the records we would magnify the virtues, we would minimize the faults. Not that the entity may not allow the faults and failures to be builded in such a way and manner as to give them power within self, but there are so many virtues, so many abilities that the entity may apply in self, that if there is not the unfoldment or the great success in this experience physically, mentally and spiritually, it is because of the entity's choosing to do wrong. The entity by nature is a good linguist, and thus it should study language as an interpreter for large cooperations in various portions of the land, or acting in the capacity as an interpreter in the established relationships offices, or such relations between countries, or as a representative of large commercial interests in these relations. But forget not who is thy keeper and what is the source of life, what is the source of help. All thy help, all the good that may come to thee, can only come from the creative forces of God. Then quit yourselves like a man. Know ye are capable with his help, not of thyself alone, but that because of thy activities ye have merited such. Use it, don't abuse it. But give the credit to him who is the giver of all good and perfect gifts. Before this we find the entity was among those who came to the land of the entity's present sojourn, for seeking a manner in which they could of themselves worship God according to the dictates of their own consciousness, in the ways and means and manners as their heart dictated, and not as others would prompt. The entity was in the environ of that now known as or called the city of brotherly love, and the entity was among those who were close in the relationships to those who were in authority. In the experience the entity made for unfoldments, and yet many of these became, as it were, as narrow as those from which the entity had sought relief. And yet, as oft found in human experience, that we condemn in others is, to be sure, the reflection of that which is error in one's own self. Yes, here we have an entity meeting its own self. These are not desirous, and yet it is for the unfoldment and development of this soul entity. Physically, only helpful influences may be brought for the mental and soul self. Much may be the contribution for this entity in the present in kindness, patience, love. All of these are needed in the body. These will aid the soul. For, remember, the soul never forgets, and that which is practiced to the soul, in the soul, will bring eventually a growth in the knowledge, in the understanding of the love of the creative forces. It is not by might and power, but by the word of truth, the word of hope, the word of kindness, of gentleness, that the formative years of this entity's unfoldment may be made, not only as a pleasure, but as an every contributing factor to that character of music which indicates the hope, the desire, the purpose for which this America came into existence, and its place, its purpose, its position in the affairs of nations as a directing influence to the hopes of man, in its greater unfoldment of bringing peace on earth, goodwill to man. There will be found, as with every true musician or every true artist, one with a great deal of imagination. Do not stop or confuse the entity in the imagination. Not so much as ever discouraging, but do not encourage to that point that it becomes solely imagination for the exaltation of its own ego. Thus, the entity will be found to be one quite sensitive, or a psychic of no mean ability, but let these influences be directed rather into the self's unfoldment or self's interpretation of the relationship of the individual to the creative forces, rather than to personal magnetism or personal desires. These are in keeping self as the means of awakening only the creative forces, or to bring about in the entertainment field, a place of rest, a place for the mind of individuals, to be changed from a work-a-day world, and with never a thought given to sordid or uncouth or the questionable, but rather the character of entertainment, that is rest to body and to mind. If the activities are in the field of teaching mysticism, or of such nature, the entity will naturally, in either case, draw about it groups of people. Thus it behooves the entity to choose its environ, and to use either of those directions for the greater unfoldment, or for the entity, to make the experience of life worthwhile. For without these activities, in whatever the environ, the entity is a part of is passing by without the entity doing anything about it. The entity has very good judgments in its own self. Those preparations in the school and in the activities should be towards music. This will ever be a field wherein the entity may apply itself to advantage, not merely as a partially prepared musician, but as an accomplished musician. This, to be sure, requires practice. This requires a great deal of study on the part of self. But this applied will bring into the experience an unfoldment to many of the beauties in nature, much of that which is the rhythm of the whole experience of life itself, and it offers a channel through which the entity through that transition period from young ladyhood to the home builder may apply self to the benefit of the many.